The temperature hit -37 degrees on Mount Elbert's north face, and 3 rescue teams had already turned back. Bodies were dropping across Colorado's backcountry as the worst blizzard in decades buried everything in its path. But while luxury mountain cabins lost power and wealthy tourists huddled around dying fires, 17-year-old Marcus Chen sat comfortably in his simple tent, warm enough to sleep in just a t-shirt. Marcus wasn't supposed to exist anymore. 5 years ago, the world thought he'd died in a climbing accident with his father. What they didn't know was that his father had been teaching him something the government desperately wanted to keep buried: ancient thermal techniques developed by his grandfather's military unit during classified Arctic operations. Now, as hypothermia claimed lives all around him, Marcus faced an impossible choice. He could save the stranded hikers using his knowledge, but doing so would expose his identity to the same people who killed his father to keep these secrets buried. Could Marcus risk everything to save strangers, or would his life-saving technique become his death sentence? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus unzipped his tent flap and peered into the howling darkness. The wind carried more than snow. It carried voices, desperate, terrified voices, somewhere below his position on the mountain's shoulder. He pulled on his worn hiking boots and grabbed his headlamp, its beam cutting through the swirling white chaos. The voices grew clearer as he descended through knee-deep powder. 2 women, maybe 300 yards down the slope, their words barely audible over the storm's fury. Marcus had been tracking their distress calls on his emergency radio for the past hour, listening as their situation deteriorated from uncomfortable to life-threatening. "Sarah, I can't feel my fingers anymore," one voice sobbed. "Stay with me, Jenna." The ranger said help was coming. Marcus knew better. He'd monitored the rescue frequency all evening. The last helicopter had turned back at 9 p.m. when wind gusts hit 80 miles per hour. The ground teams were pinned down at base camp, waiting for a break in the weather that wouldn't come until morning. By then, these women would be frozen corpses. He found them huddled against a boulder, their expensive gear useless against nature's assault. 2 college-aged women in bright REI jackets, their faces blue-white in his headlamp's glow. A torn tent flapped uselessly nearby, their sleeping bags scattered by the wind. "Oh my God!" the blonde one gasped. "Are you real?" Marcus knelt beside them, assessing their condition with practiced eyes. Moderate hypothermia, maybe severe for the brunette who'd stopped shivering, frostbite on exposed skin, dehydration. They had maybe 2 hours before organ failure began. "I'm real," he said, his voice steady despite the wind. "I'm going to get you warm." The blonde, Sarah, grabbed his arm with numb fingers. "How?" "Our gear is destroyed. We lost our sleeping bags." Marcus looked back up the slope toward his camp. His grandfather's technique could save them, but using it meant activating a beacon he'd kept dark for 5 years. The thermal signature would be unmistakable to anyone monitoring the mountain with the right equipment. His father had died for less, but as Jenna's breathing grew shallow, Marcus made his choice. "Follow me," he commanded. "Stay close and don't ask questions." He led them up the slope, supporting Jenna between Sarah and himself. The climb that should have taken 10 minutes stretched to 25 in the brutal conditions. When they reached his camp, Sarah stared in disbelief at his small, unremarkable tent. "That's it? That can't fit 3 people." Marcus was already pulling items from his pack, items he'd hoped never to use again. A small metal cylinder, no bigger than a water bottle, compressed thermal paste that looked like ordinary white putty, and an activation key that had been his father's, worn smooth by nervous fingers. "Trust me," he said, spreading the paste in a perfect circle around his tent's perimeter. The substance began to glow faintly, then brighter, melting the snow in a precise 18-inch radius. Sarah's eyes widened. "What is that stuff?" Marcus ignored her question, helping Jenna into the tent. The moment they zipped the entrance, the temperature differential was shocking. Outside, -37. Inside, a comfortable 72 degrees and rising. "This is impossible," Sarah whispered, stripping off her wet jacket as warmth flooded back into her extremities. "The laws of thermodynamics don't apply to military-grade thermal compounds," Marcus finished grimly. He watched Jenna's color return to normal, her breathing steady and deep. They would live. But somewhere in a government facility, Marcus knew an alert had just triggered. Thermal signature detected. Location, Mount Elbert North Face. Pattern recognition, Chen thermal technique confirmed. His father's killers would be mobilizing within the hour. Marcus checked his watch. 11:47 p.m. Dawn was still 7 hours away, but his 5 years of invisibility had just ended. The hunt would begin again, and this time he wouldn't have his father's protection. The mountain boy was about to become the mountain ghost once more. The wind hit like a freight train, sending Maya stumbling backward into the jagged rock face. Ice crystals stung her exposed cheeks as she squinted through the whiteout, searching desperately for any sign of her hiking companions. The trail had vanished beneath 3 feet of snow in less than an hour, and the temperature was plummeting, faster than her altitude app could register. "Derek! Sarah!" Her voice disappeared into the howling void. The GPS on her phone showed nothing but static, and the emergency beacon she'd packed seemed pathetically inadequate against nature's fury. This wasn't the gentle snowfall the weather service had predicted. This was something else entirely. A killer storm that had materialized from nowhere and transformed the familiar Rocky Mountain Trail into an Arctic wasteland. Maya pulled her hood tighter and forced herself to think. She'd done winter survival training, but nothing had prepared her for this level of exposure. Her water bottles were already starting to freeze, and she could feel the first stages of hypothermia creeping into her fingertips. If she didn't find shelter soon, the mountain would claim another victim. Through the chaos of swirling snow, a dark shape materialized ahead. At first she thought it might be a boulder or fallen tree, but as she struggled closer, the outline resolved into something impossible, a figure moving through the storm with purposeful, steady steps.
"Hey!"
she called out, her voice cracking with relief and desperation.
"Hey, wait!"
The figure stopped and turned. It was a young man, maybe mid-20s, with dark hair plastered against his forehead and piercing blue eyes that seemed unnaturally calm given the circumstances. He wore a worn canvas jacket that looked like it belonged in a museum, not on a mountain in a blizzard. No high-tech gear, no bright emergency colors, just earth tones that blended seamlessly with the landscape. "You're hypothermic," he said simply, his voice cutting through the wind with startling clarity. "How long have you been out here?" My group got separated. The storm came out of nowhere. Maya's teeth were chattering so violently she could barely form words. "Do you have a radio? We need to call for help." The stranger studied her face with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. There was something ancient in his gaze, like he'd seen too much for someone so young. "No rescue teams are getting up here tonight, maybe not for days. You're bleeding." Maya touched her temple and felt the warm stickiness she hadn't noticed before. "I fell when the wind hit. Listen, I'm Maya Chen, and I really need—" "Ethan," he interrupted, already moving past her. "There's a shelter about half a mile north. Can you walk?" Something about his certainty cut through her panic. While she'd been stumbling around in terror, he moved like he owned these mountains. "You live up here?" "Sometimes." Ethan was already walking, and Maya had no choice but to follow. Step where I step, the snow's hiding some nasty drops. As they moved through the storm, Maya noticed details that defied explanation. Ethan never hesitated about direction, never checked a compass or GPS. His footing was sure even on terrain she couldn't see. More disturbing, he seemed to know exactly where patches of unstable snow waited to give way. Twice, he pulled her back from what looked like solid ground, only for her to hear the ominous crack of a hidden crevice beneath. "How do you know this area so well?" she asked, during a brief lull in the wind. Ethan paused, and for a moment, something vulnerable flickered across his features. "I've had a lot of time to learn. The shelter turned out to be a natural cave tucked behind a screen of evergreens, invisible until you were almost inside. But someone had modified it. Carefully stacked stones created a wind barrier, and a fire ring showed signs of regular use. Strips of bark and bundled pine needles were arranged in neat piles, ready for lighting. Within minutes, Ethan had a fire blazing using nothing but flint and steel. Maya watched in amazement as he worked, his movements economical and precise. Everything about this place suggested long-term habitation, but there were no modern conveniences, no camping gear, she recognized. "You're not just some day hiker who got caught in the storm," she observed, as feeling returned to her hands. Ethan fed twigs into the flames, avoiding her eyes. "Neither are you. That gear you're wearing cost more than most people make in a month, and you're carrying enough emergency equipment for a small expedition. I work in risk assessment for insurance companies, mountain rescues specifically." Maya studied his reaction carefully. "Part of my job involves finding people who don't want to be found." The admission hung between them like a challenge. Ethan's hand froze halfway to the fire, and when he looked up, Maya saw something that made her pulse quicken. Not fear exactly, but recognition, like he'd been expecting this conversation for a very long time. Outside, the storm raged with increasing fury, but inside their small circle of firelight, Maya realized she might have stumbled onto something far more dangerous than bad weather. The wind's howl had become a living thing, clawing at the emergency shelter Marcus had constructed from fallen branches and emergency blankets. Inside the cramped space, Sarah Chen pressed her back against the insulated wall, watching him work by the dim glow of her headlamp. His movements were precise, methodical, nothing like the panicked fumbling she'd expect from someone facing a killer storm. "Where did you learn to do this?" she asked, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Marcus paused, his hands stilling over the small fire he'd somehow coaxed to life, despite the moisture and wind. Trial and error. It wasn't the whole truth. Sarah had been a journalist before she'd burned out and taken to hiking as therapy, and she recognized evasion when she heard it. But hypothermia was creeping in around the edges of her consciousness, making her thoughts sluggish. The questions could wait. The others she managed through chattering teeth. "Do you think they made it to shelter?" Marcus fed another carefully chosen twig to the flames. He'd been thinking about the hiking group they'd encountered 3 hours before the storm hit. A family from Denver with inadequate gear and overconfident attitudes. The kind of people who thought expensive jackets could substitute for experience. "Maybe," he said, though his expression suggested otherwise. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the shelter walls. Sarah studied Marcus's face in the flickering light. He was younger than she'd initially thought, maybe late 20s, with the kind of weathered features that spoke of years outdoors. But there was something else, a hyper-vigilance that went beyond normal mountain caution. The way his eyes flicked toward the shelter entrance at every sound, the methodical way he'd checked and rechecked their supplies. Like someone who'd learned to be afraid. "You've been out here a long time," she said. It wasn't a question. Marcus nodded slowly. 5 years, give or take. That's a long give or take. He looked at her then, really looked, and Sarah saw something flicker behind his eyes. Pain, maybe, or recognition of a choice he'd have to make soon. Outside, the storm intensified. The shelter shuddered under a particularly vicious gust, and Sarah instinctively moved closer to the fire. Marcus reached into his pack and withdrew something wrapped in oiled cloth. His movements were careful, almost reverent. "What is that?" Sarah asked. Marcus unwrapped the cloth to reveal a hand-carved flute worn smooth by years of handling. The wood was dark, polished to a deep sheen, and covered in intricate symbols that seemed to shift in the firelight. "Insurance," he said. Before Sarah could ask what he meant, Marcus raised the flute to his lips and began to play. The melody that emerged was unlike anything she'd ever heard, haunting and primal, with notes that seemed to bend and weave around each other in impossible harmonies. But more than the beauty of the music, Sarah felt something else. The temperature in the shelter was rising, not just from the fire. The very air around them seemed to warm, as if the music was pulling heat from somewhere else entirely. Sarah's chattering stopped. Her fingers, which had been going numb despite her gloves, began to tingle with returning circulation. "How?" she started to ask, but Marcus shook his head slightly, never breaking the melody. The music continued for perhaps 10 minutes, growing more complex and layered despite coming from a single instrument. Sarah found herself mesmerized, not just by the impossible warmth spreading through the shelter, but by the expression on Marcus's face. His eyes were closed, and tears tracked down his cheeks. When the last note faded, the shelter felt like a pocket of spring in the midst of the raging blizzard. "My grandfather taught me," Marcus said quietly, rapping the flute again, before they took him away. Sarah's journalist instincts, fully awakened despite her exhaustion. "Took him where?" Marcus was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible over the storm. "There are things in these mountains that most people have forgotten. Old knowledge, old agreements. My grandfather was one of the last who remembered." He looked at her again, and this time Sarah saw the weight he carried, the burden of being the keeper of something ancient and terrible. "The technique I just used, it doesn't come free," Marcus continued. "Every time I play the old songs, I leave a trace, a signature that certain people know how to follow." "What people?" Marcus began banking the fire for the night, his movements once again precise and economical. "The kind who've been hunting my family for 3 generations. Outside, the wind screamed like something alive and hungry. Sarah pulled her sleeping bag tighter around her shoulders, but the chill she felt now had nothing to do with the temperature. "How long do we have?" she asked. Marcus settled into his own sleeping area, but Sarah noticed he kept his boots on. "Until morning, if we're lucky." The wind had teeth now, sharp and merciless, as it carved through the canyon walls. Marcus pressed his back against the granite outcropping, feeling the cold seep through his jacket despite the shelter. 3 feet away, Sarah's lips were turning blue, and beyond her, the college kid, Jake, he'd said his name was, sat hunched in a ball, shivering so violently his teeth chattered like castanets. They wouldn't last another hour at this rate. Marcus closed his eyes and let his mind drift back, past the careful barriers he'd built over 5 years of self-imposed exile. The memory came reluctantly, like smoke through a crack, his grandfather's weathered hands demonstrating the ancient technique, the old man's voice rough as sandpaper as he explained what their people had known for generations. "Sometimes the mountain takes," grandfather had said in Ute, his words barely audible above the practice fire. "Sometimes it gives, but you must know how to ask." The technique had a name in the old language, Nuchiu Navichi, the breath of stone. It was something the Park Service didn't teach, something that wouldn't appear in any wilderness survival manual, something Marcus had sworn never to use again. But watching Sarah's breath come in short, desperate puffs, he felt that oath cracking like ice under pressure. "We need to move," Jake stammered through chattering teeth. "Find real shelter." "In this?" Sarah gestured weakly at the wall of white beyond their meager refuge. "We can't see 10 feet. We'll walk right off a cliff." Marcus opened his eyes and studied the rock face behind them. Granite, mostly, with veins of quartz threading through like frozen lightning. The formation was wrong for what he needed, but there, 20 yards to their left, barely visible through the storm, a darker shadow suggested different stone entirely. "Stay here," he said, pushing himself up. "Where are you going?" Sarah grabbed his arm. "Don't be stupid. I'm not leaving you." He gently pulled free from her grip. "I'm going to make us warm." Before either of them could protest, Marcus stepped out into the howling wind. The cold hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath and sending ice crystals stabbing into his exposed skin. He pushed forward, one careful step at a time, until he reached the darker rock. Sandstone, perfect. Marcus pulled off his gloves and pressed his palms against the stone, feeling for the telltale vibrations his grandfather had taught him to recognize. The rock here was different, older, with pockets of air trapped in its formation, spaces where pressure could build, where the mountain's own heat could be coaxed to the surface. He found what he was looking for 6 feet up, a natural chimney in the rock, narrow as a pencil but running deep into the stone's heart. Working quickly, his fingers already going numb, Marcus gathered the specific materials he needed. Not just any tinder, it had to be inner bark from the stunted pines clinging to the cliff face, mixed with the dried fungus that grew in the rock's crevices. The old knowledge was specific, precise. The hardest part was the kindling. Nuchi u Navici required a particular type of wood, pieces that would burn hot and fast while creating the pressure differential his grandfather had shown him. Marcus climbed higher, ignoring the wind that threatened to tear him from the rock face until he found the gnarled juniper he needed. 20 minutes later, he'd built something that looked nothing like a normal fire. The arrangement of stones and kindling formed a careful spiral around the rock chimney, designed to draw air up through the sandstone's hidden passages. When he finally lit it, the flames seemed to disappear into the rock itself. For a moment, nothing happened. Marcus crouched in the snow, watching his impossible fire burn invisibly, wondering if 5 years away from the old ways had cost him the knowledge that might save them. Then the rock began to warm. It started as barely perceptible heat radiating from the stone face, so subtle he might have imagined it. But within minutes, the warmth was unmistakable, spreading outward from the hidden fire burning deep in the sandstone's heart. The snow around the base of the cliff began to melt, creating a pocket of relative warmth in the storm's fury. Marcus called to the others, his voice barely carrying over the wind. He watched Sarah and Jake struggle through the snow toward him, saw the moment when they felt the heat and stopped, staring at the impossibly warm stone with expressions of disbelief. How? Sarah pressed her hands against the radiating warmth, color already returning to her face. Marcus turned away from her questioning gaze, feeding more of the special kindling into his hidden fire. He couldn't tell her the truth, that this technique had been passed down through generations of his people, that using it marked him as surely as a signature. Couldn't explain that somewhere out there, if anyone still remembered the old ways, they would see this unnatural warmth bleeding from the mountain and know exactly who had created it. The very knowledge that might save their lives could destroy the careful anonymity he'd built over 5 years of running from what he'd done. The wind howled through the pine trees, like a living thing seeking revenge. Maya pressed herself against the rough bark of an ancient spruce, her breath forming crystals that fell to join the knee-deep snow at her feet. She'd lost sight of the trail markers 20 minutes ago, and the GPS on her phone had given up pretending to work in this whiteout nightmare. Her hiking partner Jake should have been right behind her, but when she turned to check, there was nothing but swirling white chaos. The storm had descended so quickly that what started as a leisurely afternoon hike had become a fight for survival. The temperature had plummeted at least 30 degrees in the past hour, and her lightweight jacket felt like tissue paper against the brutal wind. "Jake!" she called out, but the storm swallowed her voice before it could travel more than a few feet. Panic began to claw at her chest. They'd been hiking together for 3 years, and Jake knew these mountains better than anyone. If he was lost too, they were in serious trouble. That's when she saw the figure moving through the trees. At first, Maya thought it might be Jake, but this person moved differently, with a fluid, almost predatory grace that seemed unaffected by the storm. As the figure drew closer, she could make out more details. A young man, maybe mid-20s, wearing what looked like handmade winter gear. His dark hair was long and unkempt, partially hidden beneath a fur-lined hood that had definitely not come from any outdoor equipment store. "You're going to freeze to death if you stay out here," he said, his voice cutting through the wind with surprising clarity. Up close, Maya could see his eyes, pale grey like winter ice, set in a face that was both youthful and somehow ancient. "I'm looking for my friend," Maya shouted back. "We got separated when the storm hit." The stranger studied her for a moment, then nodded toward a cluster of boulders she hadn't noticed. "There's someone over there. Might be him." Maya stumbled through the snow, following the stranger's lead. Sure enough, Jake was huddled behind the largest boulder, his lips already showing the telltale blue tinge of hypothermia. He looked up at them with confusion and relief. "Maya?" Thank God. I thought, who's this? Name's Cal, the stranger said, kneeling beside Jake and examining him with practiced efficiency. You're hypothermic. We need to get you warm fast. Maya watched in amazement as Cal began working with his hands in the snow, shaping it into what looked like building blocks. What are you doing? Making shelter, the old way. His movements were swift and sure, as if he'd done this 1,000 times before. Snow's actually a great insulator if you know how to work with it. Within minutes, Cal had constructed the beginnings of what Maya realized was a snow cave, but unlike any she'd seen in survival guides. The entrance was angled in a way that seemed to deflect the wind entirely, and the interior space was larger than should have been possible, given how quickly he'd built it. Get him inside, Cal instructed, helping Maya move Jake into the shelter. The difference was immediate. The howling wind became a distant whisper, and the temperature felt at least 20 degrees warmer. Cal disappeared for a moment and returned with an armload of dry wood that seemed impossible to find in a blizzard. Soon he had a small fire burning, using techniques Maya had never seen before. The smoke was channeled out through carefully constructed vents that didn't let any heat escape. How do you know how to do all this? Maya asked, watching Jake's color slowly return to normal. Cal's expression darkened. You learn things when you have to. But this isn't just basic survival stuff. This is like advanced wilderness knowledge. Where did you learn it? For a moment, Cal's carefully controlled demeanor cracked, and Maya saw something that looked like pain flash across his features. My grandfather taught me when I was a kid. Before, he trailed off, poking at the fire with unnecessary vigor. Before what? Before everything went wrong. Cal's voice was barely above a whisper. Before I had to disappear. Jake, who had been quietly recovering, suddenly looked more alert. Wait, Cal, did you say? There was a kid who went missing in these mountains about 5 years ago. Calvin Morrison. His whole family was... Jake stopped, studying Cal's face more carefully. The temperature in the cave seemed to drop again, despite the fire. Cal's jaw tightened, and Maya could see his hands clench into fists. That kid is dead, Cal said flatly. Died the same night his family did. But I'm nobody, Cal cut him off. Just someone who knows how to survive in places where other people die. The wind outside grew stronger, as if the storm itself was responding to the tension in their small shelter. Maya realized that while Cal might have saved their lives, they were now trapped with someone carrying secrets that ran deeper and darker than the mountain winter surrounding them. The wind had died to a whisper by the time Kai finished packing the snow around their shelter's entrance. Inside the improvised cave, Maya's breathing had steadied, and the college kids had finally stopped their panicked chatter. But the silence that replaced it felt heavier somehow, pregnant with unspoken questions. How did you know to do that? Jessica asked, her voice barely audible above the crackling of their small fire. She was staring at the intricate ventilation system Kai had carved into the snow walls, a series of channels that somehow kept fresh air flowing while maintaining their body heat. Kai's hands stilled on the kindling. Trial and error. Bullshit. The word came from Tyler, who'd been watching Kai's every move since they'd started digging. I've been winter camping since I was 12. That's not something you just figure out. Maya opened her eyes, studying Kai's profile in the flickering light. The way you moved out there in the storm, you weren't just surviving. You knew exactly what you were doing. Does it matter? Kai stood abruptly, his shadow dancing against the curved walls. We're alive. That's what counts. It matters because there's something you're not telling us. Tyler shifted closer to the fire, his college boy bravado cracking to reveal genuine fear. And if we're going to be stuck here together, we deserve to know who we're trusting with our lives. Kai felt the familiar weight of his past pressing down like the storm outside. 5 years of careful isolation, of becoming someone else. And now these strangers were pulling at threads he'd buried deep. He could see Jessica's phone lying useless beside her, its screen black. Even if the towers were working, who would she call? Who would come looking for Maya Chen, star investigative journalist, when she'd told her editor she was taking personal time? "My father taught me," he said finally, the words tasting like ash. "Before he died." It was true enough, just not the whole truth. Maya's journalist instincts kicked in despite her exhaustion. What kind of father teaches his kid to build shelters like this? Military? Something like that. Kai fed another piece of wood to the fire, watching the flames devour it. He believed in being prepared for anything, including disappearing into the wilderness for years. Tyler's voice carried an edge now. "Because that's what this is, isn't it? You're not just some hiker who knows these mountains. You live here." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Kai could feel Jessica's eyes on him too, wide and uncertain. Even Maya had pushed herself up on her elbows, her reporter's mind clearly working despite her injuries. "I live here because I choose to," Kai said, "because sometimes the world gets too complicated for simple solutions." "What did you do?" The question came from Maya, soft but insistent. 5 years ago. What happened that made you run?" The wind picked up again outside, howling through their ventilation system with renewed fury. Kai listened to it for a moment, remembering another storm, another night when the world had collapsed around him, when everything he'd believed about his father, about their life together, about the reason they'd been hiding in these same mountains, had turned to lies. "You really want to know?" He turned to face them, and something in his expression made Jessica shrink back. "My father wasn't military. He was a researcher for a pharmaceutical company called Nexus Dynamics. He stole something. Data, formulas, I never knew exactly what. But it was important enough that they hunted us for 3 years before they found our cabin." Tyler's face had gone pale. "Nexus Dynamics. Jesus, my dad works for them. They're huge." "Yeah, well, they're also killers." Kai's voice was flat, emotionless. "They made it look like a gas leak. Pure accident. Father and son die in their remote cabin. Tragic but unremarkable. Except I wasn't there that night. I was checking trap lines when it happened." Maya struggled to sit up fully. "You witnessed it?" "I watched them leave. 3 men in a black SUV, driving away from my burning home with my father's body still inside. The memories came flooding back. The smell of propane and charred wood, the way the flames had lit up the snow-covered trees like twisted Christmas lights. They never knew I existed. Official records show David Chen died alone. The silence that followed was deafening. Jessica was staring at him with her mouth open. Tyler had gone completely white, but it was Maya's reaction that surprised him. Instead of fear, he saw something like recognition in her eyes. "Chen," she whispered. "Dr. David Chen. I remember that story. It was in the back pages of the Denver Post. But the name was my father's real name. Before Nexus. Before we became the Morrisons and disappeared into these mountains." Kai met her gaze steadily. "And now you know why. I really can't leave." Outside, the storm raged on, but inside their shelter, the only sound was the crackling of the fire and the rapid breathing of 3 people who'd just learned they were trapped with a dead man. The wind howled like a living thing, clawing at the reinforced shelter walls as Marcus finished securing the last corner of their expanded windbreak. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, weaving pine boughs through the framework he'd constructed using techniques that felt both foreign and familiar. Each knot, each angle seemed to flow from muscle memory he couldn't quite place. "Where did you learn this?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible above the storm. She was huddled close to the small fire he'd managed to coax to life using bark shavings and a method involving 2 specific types of wood that he somehow knew would work together. Marcus paused, his fingers still wrapped around a length of paracord. The question hung in the frigid air like a blade. "Just picked it up," he said finally, but even to his own ears the words sounded hollow. The truth was becoming harder to avoid. Every survival technique that surfaced from the depths of his memory felt too precise, too specialized for casual learning. The way he'd identified which snow was safe to melt for drinking water, how he'd known to construct the shelter's entrance facing southeast to capture maximum morning sun while avoiding the prevailing winds. These weren't skills from weekend camping trips. My grandfather, he added quietly, surprised by his own words. He taught me some things. It wasn't entirely a lie. There had been an old man, weathered hands guiding his smaller ones, showing him how to read the forest signs, but the memories felt distant and fractured, like looking through broken glass. Jake groaned from where he lay near the fire, his injured leg elevated on Marcus's improvised splint. "Doesn't matter where he learned it," he said through gritted teeth. "Just glad he did." Emma nodded, unwrapping one of their dwindling energy bars. The temperature's still dropping. Without this shelter, she didn't finish the sentence, but they all understood. Marcus checked his watch. 3:47 p.m. They'd been trapped for nearly 6 hours, and the blizzard showed no signs of weakening. If anything, the wind was intensifying, driving snow through the smallest gaps in their defenses. He'd need to reinforce the structure again soon, but their materials were running low. "We need to talk about food," Emma said, voicing what they were all thinking. "We have maybe 2 days' worth if we ration carefully." "The storm can't last that long," Sarah protested, but uncertainty colored her voice. Marcus studied the swirling wall of white beyond their shelter. Something about the cloud formations he'd glimpsed before the visibility dropped to zero nagged at him. This wasn't a typical mountain squall. The pressure changes, the way the wind patterns had shifted, it reminded him of something. A half-remembered lesson about reading weather signs. "It could," he said slowly. "This feels like a multi-day system. How can you possibly know that?" Sarah's question carried a sharper edge now, suspicion creeping into her tone. Before Marcus could answer, a sound cut through the wind, distant but distinct. A helicopter. They all froze, listening intently. The rhythmic thump of rotor blades grew closer, then began to fade. "They're searching," Emma breathed. Sarah was already scrambling for her pack. "We need to signal them." "Wait," Marcus caught her arm. "They can't land in this. Even if they see us, the downdraft from the rotors will destroy our shelter, and the storm's too severe for a rescue attempt." "But they'll know where we are," Sarah argued. "And then what? They'll have to wait for the storm to pass, same as us. Meanwhile, we'll be exposed and hypothermic." The helicopter sound was fading now, growing distant. Sarah's face cycled through frustration, hope and despair in rapid succession. "He's right," Jake said reluctantly. "Better to stay put." As the aircraft disappeared entirely, Marcus felt the weight of their stares. He'd made the call instinctively, but now he wondered if it had been the right one, or, more troubling, why he'd been so certain about rescue protocol in extreme weather conditions. "You seem to know a lot about search and rescue," Emma observed carefully. The words hit him like a physical blow. Images flashed through his mind, orange and black uniforms, rappelling gear, the sound of rotors overhead. Not as someone being rescued, but as someone doing the rescuing. "Just common sense," he managed, but his voice sounded strained. As night began to fall and the temperature plummeted further, Marcus worked to expand their heat retention system, building thermal mass with heated stones and creating air circulation patterns that would prevent carbon monoxide buildup. Each modification felt natural, automatic. But with every technique that emerged from his subconscious, the questions multiplied. Who had he been before he'd come to these mountains? And more importantly, what was he running from? Outside, the storm raged on, but inside their small sanctuary, another kind of tempest was building, one that threatened to expose secrets Marcus wasn't sure he was ready to face. The wind had grown teeth overnight, gnawing through the shelter's carefully constructed walls with predatory persistence. Maya pressed her back against the packed snow, feeling the cold seep through her jacket like ice water finding cracks in stone. Across from her, Dr. Chen's breathing had become shallow and rapid, the early signs of hypothermia that she'd studied in her wilderness medicine courses but never witnessed firsthand. "We need to move him closer to the center," Kai whispered, his voice barely audible above the storm's roar. He crawled toward the older man with movements that seemed almost ritualistic in their precision. "Don't touch him yet." The command came from somewhere deeper in the shelter, where shadows pooled like black water. Thomas emerged from the darkness, his eyes reflecting what little light filtered through their snow dome. His body temperature has dropped below critical threshold. Standard rewarming protocols will send him into shock. Maya watched as Thomas positioned himself beside Dr. Chen, his hands hovering inches above the man's chest. What happened next defied everything she'd learned in her medical training. Thomas began a series of movements, part massage, part pressure point manipulation that seemed to follow patterns older than any textbook. "How do you know that technique?" The question escaped before Maya could stop herself. Thomas's hands never paused in their work, but she saw something flicker across his face. "Fear, emergency response training," he said, but the lie sat heavy in the frigid air between them. Kai shifted closer, studying Thomas's movements with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. "That's not standard wilderness first aid. Those pressure points, they're based on traditional healing methods, indigenous techniques." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Thomas's hands finally stilled, and Maya saw Dr. Chen's breathing begin to deepen and slow. Color started returning to the older man's lips, a small miracle in their frozen tomb. "Sometimes old knowledge works better than new," Thomas said, settling back against the wall. But Maya caught the way his eyes darted toward the shelter's entrance, as if calculating escape routes even now. "Old knowledge that you just happened to learn in emergency response training?" Kai's voice carried a dangerous edge. "My grandmother was a traditional healer on the reservation. She taught me some of those same techniques before she died. What she didn't teach me was how a white kid from suburbia would know healing methods that were passed down through generations of my people." The temperature in the shelter seemed to drop another 10 degrees. Maya felt the tension crystallizing between the two men like frost forming on glass. Outside, the blizzard continued its assault, but inside their small refuge, a different kind of storm was brewing. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing patterns in the snow beside him. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of confession. "I wasn't always Thomas Reed." The words fell between them like stones dropped into deep water. Maya found herself holding her breath, knowing that whatever came next would change everything. 5 years ago, I was someone else entirely, someone who made mistakes that got people killed." His hands stilled their nervous movement. "I came to these mountains to disappear, and an old man found me instead, nearly dead from exposure, just like Dr. Chen. His name was Joseph Standing Bear, and he saved my life." Kai's entire posture changed, anger transforming into something else, recognition. Standing Bear. "You knew my great-uncle?" "He took me in for 2 winters, taught me how to survive up here, how to read the mountains like a book. But more than that, he taught me healing, old ways that his grandfather had shown him." Thomas looked directly at Kai now, and Maya saw tears freezing at the corners of his eyes. "He died because of me, because people came looking, and I wasn't careful enough about covering my tracks." The revelation hit the shelter like an avalanche. Maya felt pieces of the puzzle clicking together. Thomas's uncanny knowledge of the mountains, his reluctance to use technology, the way he seemed to anticipate the storm's every move. He wasn't just a survivalist, he was someone running from something so dangerous that it had cost an innocent man his life. "What did you do?" Maya's voice was barely a whisper. "What were you running from?" But before Thomas could answer, a new sound cut through the wind's howl. The rhythmic whup, whup, whup of helicopter rotors, growing louder despite the storm. Maya felt hope surge in her chest. Rescue was coming. But when she looked at Thomas, she saw only terror. "They found me," he breathed, and suddenly Maya understood that whatever was hunting Thomas was far worse than any blizzard. The helicopter's sound grew closer, and she realized that their fight for survival had just become infinitely more complicated. The wind howled through the gaps in the shelter, carrying with it the scent of approaching death. Marcus crouched beside Elena, whose breathing had become shallow and erratic. Her lips were tinged blue despite the small fire he'd managed to coax from damp kindling using techniques his father had beaten into him during those brutal training sessions in the Alaskan wilderness. "We need to get her core temperature up," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm. "She's going into hypothermic shock." Marcus nodded, his mind racing through the survival protocols drilled into him since childhood. But it wasn't his father's voice he heard now. It was his own, younger self, terrified and desperate, using a technique he'd sworn never to think about again. "I need you to trust me," he said, already stripping off his outer layers. "This is going to look strange, but it's the only way." Before Sarah could protest, Marcus was positioning Elena's unconscious form, arranging her limbs in a specific pattern he'd learned when he was barely 10 years old. His hands moved with muscle memory, creating what his captors had called the heat spiral, a body positioning technique that maximized core warmth retention and improved circulation. The irony wasn't lost on him. The same knowledge that had kept him alive during his 3-month ordeal was now saving someone else. "Where did you learn this?" Sarah asked, watching as Marcus worked with practiced precision. "Wilderness survival course," he lied smoothly, focusing on Elena's pulse points. The truth was buried too deep, wrapped in too much pain to excavate here in this makeshift shelter while people were dying around him. As Elena's breathing began to stabilize, Marcus allowed himself a moment of relief, but it was short-lived. Through the storm's fury, he heard something that made his blood freeze, the distant sound of helicopters. Search and rescue. They should have been a welcome sound, but Marcus knew better. The storm was too severe for standard SAR operations, which meant whoever was out there had resources beyond normal emergency services. His past was catching up to him. "Do you hear that?" Sarah asked, hope creeping into her voice. Marcus was already moving, extinguishing their small fire with handfuls of snow. "We need to move. Now. Are you insane? Elena can barely—" "Listen to me." His voice carried an urgency that stopped her protest. "Those aren't rescue helicopters. Not in this weather. Not with this visibility." The pieces were falling into place with terrifying clarity. The timing of the storm, their isolated location, the fact that their emergency beacon had mysteriously malfunctioned. None of it was coincidence. They'd found him. 5 years of careful anonymity, of deliberate isolation, and somehow Dr. Nathaniel Reeves and his research team had tracked him down, the same people who had taken a scared 15-year-old and subjected him to months of psychological and physical conditioning, studying his responses to extreme survival situations. "Marcus, you're scaring me," Sarah said, but she was already helping him lift Elena. "There's a cave system about half a mile north," he said, his mind automatically calculating routes and contingencies. "We can shelter there until the storm passes." What he didn't tell her was that the caves would also mask their heat signatures from thermal imaging, and the mineral composition would interfere with tracking equipment. Details he shouldn't know. Survival knowledge that went far beyond what any normal person would possess. They struggled through the deepening snow, Marcus supporting most of Elena's weight while Sarah fought to keep up. The helicopter sounds grew closer, and Marcus could make out the distinctive whine of military-grade rotors cutting through the wind. Reeves had always been thorough. If he'd found Marcus, he wouldn't be coming alone or unprepared. The cave entrance was barely visible through the swirling snow, a dark gash in the mountainside that promised shelter but also potential entrapment. Marcus hesitated for a moment, weighing their options. In the distance, he could see the faint sweep of searchlights cutting through the storm. "In here," he decided, guiding them into the darkness. The cave was larger than it appeared from outside, with a network of passages that disappeared into the mountain's depths. Marcus chose a chamber deep enough to muffle sound, but close enough to the entrance that they could monitor outside activity. As they settled Elena onto a bed of pine boughs Marcus quickly gathered, Sarah finally asked the question he'd been dreading. "Who are you, really?" Marcus stared at the cave entrance, watching for signs of pursuit. The helicopter sounds had faded, but that didn't mean they were safe. Reeves was patient, methodical. He would establish a perimeter and wait. "Someone who should have stayed lost," Marcus finally answered. Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault, but Marcus knew the weather was the least of their problems now. His past had finally caught up to him, and this time there might be nowhere left to run. The hunt had begun again. Storm had transformed the landscape into an alien world of white. Marcus pressed himself against the rocky outcrop, his breathing coming in sharp bursts as he scanned the tree line below. Through the swirling snow, he could make out movement. 3 figures in dark winter gear moving with the purposeful precision he remembered all too well. They'd found him. 5 years of careful isolation, of becoming someone else entirely, and somehow Director Chen's people had tracked him to these remote peaks. The irony wasn't lost on him that the very skills keeping Sarah and the others alive were the same ones that had made him valuable enough to hunt. "Marcus?" Sarah's voice cut through his racing thoughts. She was 20 feet away, helping Tom redistribute the weight in his pack. "You see something?" He forced his expression neutral, though his mind was calculating distances and escape routes. "Just checking our path ahead. Storm's getting worse." It wasn't entirely a lie. The blizzard was intensifying, but that might be their only advantage now. The whiteout conditions that made survival so treacherous could also provide cover. He just had to get the group moving without revealing why speed had suddenly become critical. "We need to push harder," he said, rejoining them. "There's a shelter system about 2 miles northeast. We can wait out the worst of it there." Tom looked skeptical. "In this visibility, we'll get turned around and lost." "Trust me." Marcus shouldered his pack, mind already mapping the route. The old mining complex would provide shelter, but more importantly, it had multiple exit points. If Chen's team followed them in, he could lead them away from the others. "I know these mountains better than the storm does." As they began moving, Marcus caught Sarah studying his face. Her analytical mind was picking up on something, the tension he couldn't quite hide, the way his eyes kept drifting back toward the tree line. "What aren't you telling us?" she asked quietly, falling into step beside him. The question hit closer to home than she could know. Everything, he wanted to say. How the breathing techniques he'd taught them came from classified military research, how the shelter-building methods were developed in black sites for operatives stranded behind enemy lines, how every survival skill that had kept them alive was paid for with blood and betrayal. "Just focused on getting us through this," he said instead. They climbed in single file through the deepening snow, Marcus leading with sure steps despite the near-zero visibility. Behind them, Jake struggled but didn't complain, still weak from his earlier hypothermic episode. Every few minutes, Marcus would pause, ostensibly to check on the group but really to listen for sounds of pursuit. The wind carried voices once, distant shouts that could have been search and rescue but that Marcus recognized as tactical communication. Chen's people were closing in, moving faster than a group burdened with civilians ever could. There, Marcus pointed through the swirling white to where the dark outline of a structure emerged from the storm. The old mining office was partially collapsed, but still provided 4 solid walls and most of a roof. "We'll set up inside." As they took shelter, Marcus made his decision. The team pursuing them wouldn't stop. He knew Chen well enough to be certain of that. They'd follow him to the ends of the earth before giving up what he'd stolen from them. The only way to protect Sarah and the others was to lead the threat away. "I need to scout ahead," he announced, checking his gear with deliberate casualness. "Make sure the route down is still passable after this storm." Sarah was on her feet immediately. "We stick together. That was the rule." "The rule was survival," Marcus replied, meeting her eyes. For a moment, he let her see past his careful facade, the regret, the fear not for himself, but for what his presence had brought upon them. Sometimes that means hard choices. Understanding flickered across her face. She'd put together enough pieces to know there was more to his story, even if she didn't know the specifics. "How long?" she asked simply. "Few hours. There's enough firewood to keep warm, and the storm should break by morning." He handed her the emergency radio. "If I'm not back by dawn, head southwest toward the ranger station. Follow the creek bed. It'll lead you out." Tom started to protest, but Sarah silenced him with a look. She understood what Marcus wasn't saying, that his scouting mission was really about drawing away whatever danger was following them. "Be careful," was all she said. Marcus nodded and stepped back into the storm. Within moments, the mining office disappeared behind him, swallowed by white. He moved quickly now, no longer hiding his tracks, but instead making them obvious, a clear trail for Chen's team to follow. The wind howled around him as he climbed higher into the mountains, toward the remote places where he could face his past without endangering the people who'd become, unexpectedly, worth protecting with his life. The radio crackled to life, just as Marcus finished reinforcing the shelter's entrance with pine boughs. Sarah's voice cut through the static, urgent and strained. "Marcus, we've got a problem. Jake's temperature is spiking and Emma, she's not responding to verbal commands anymore. Whatever you did for Tom, we need it here. Now." Marcus closed his eyes, feeling the familiar weight of impossible choices settling on his shoulders. The technique his grandfather had taught him wasn't just about reading the mountain's moods or finding shelter in impossible places. It was about understanding the body's relationship with cold, about manipulating circulation and core temperature in ways that modern medicine barely acknowledged. It was also about accepting responsibility for lives that might be lost if he failed. "I'm coming," he said into the radio. "Keep them warm, but don't let them fall asleep. Make them talk, sing, anything." Tom looked up from where he sat near the small fire, color finally returning to his cheeks. "You saved my life back there. I don't know what you did, but I felt it working, like you were pulling the cold right out of my bones." "Ancient Arapaho technique," Marcus said, already gathering his pack. "My grandfather learned it from the old-timers before the knowledge got lost. It wasn't entirely a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. The technique was older than that, passed down through bloodlines that traced back to the first people who had learned to survive these peaks. His grandfather hadn't just been Arapaho, he'd been something more, something the modern world had no name for. "I'm coming with you," Tom said, struggling to stand. "You're not strong enough yet. Those are my friends out there." Tom's voice carried a determination that reminded Marcus why he'd been drawn to help them in the first place. "Besides, you might need an extra pair of hands." Marcus weighed the options. The storm was intensifying, and the route to the other shelter would be treacherous even for someone at full strength. But Tom was right about one thing. If Jake and Emma were both deteriorating, he might need help. "Stay close," Marcus finally said. "If you can't keep up, I'm leaving you behind." They ventured back into the maelstrom, the wind hitting them like a physical blow. Marcus felt the mountain's anger in the gusts, heard its voice in the howling that seemed to come from the peaks themselves. This wasn't just weather, it was the kind of storm that reshaped landscapes, that buried entire valleys under avalanches. His grandfather had taught him to listen to these voices, to understand what the mountain was trying to say. Tonight, it was screaming warnings about something far worse than wind and snow. They fought their way across the exposed ridge, Marcus using techniques his grandfather had shown him to read the snow conditions underfoot, to sense where the wind would be less brutal. Tom struggled but kept pace, his determination overriding his physical limitations. When they finally reached the second shelter, Marcus could hear Jake's labored breathing even through the storm. Sarah met them at the entrance, her face pale with exhaustion and fear. "Thank God you're here. Jake started convulsing about 20 minutes ago, and Emma—" She gestured helplessly toward the back of the shelter where Emma lay motionless, her skin an alarming shade of grey. Marcus knelt beside Emma first, placing his hands on her chest and forehead. Her pulse was barely detectable, her breathing shallow and irregular, severe hypothermia, but still within the range where the old techniques might work. He closed his eyes and let his grandfather's training take over, feeling for the spark of warmth that still flickered deep in her core. The technique required him to open himself to the cold, to draw it away from her body and into his own, then dispel it through controlled breathing and meditation. It was dangerous. Each time he used it, he risked losing pieces of himself to the mountain's hunger. But as he worked, guiding Emma's circulation back toward normal patterns, he felt something else. A presence watching from beyond the storm, something that had been tracking him ever since he'd started using the old knowledge again. "Marcus," Tom's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Your hands, they're glowing." Marcus opened his eyes and saw the faint luminescence emanating from his palms where they touched Emma's skin. It was barely visible, like moonlight through fog, but unmistakable. Sarah stared in shock. "What are you?" Before Marcus could answer, Emma's eyes fluttered open, and she drew a deep, shuddering breath. Color began returning to her cheeks as her body temperature stabilized. But the damage was done. They'd seen too much, and somewhere out in the storm, Marcus could sense other watchers taking notice. The technique his grandfather had taught him came with rules, and he'd just broken the most important one. Never let the modern world see what you really are. Jake's convulsions were getting worse, and Marcus knew he had no choice but to help him too, even knowing that each use of the old knowledge brought him closer to a reckoning he'd been avoiding for 5 years. The wind had died to an eerie whisper by the time Marcus led the group down the treacherous slope toward what remained of the ranger station. Sarah's breathing had steadied, but her lips still held a blue tinge that made his chest tight with worry. Behind them, the others followed in single file, their makeshift snowshoes crunching softly in the deep powder. Marcus's mind raced as they descended. The shelter techniques, the precise knowledge of hypothermia stages, the way he'd known exactly which plants could provide emergency nutrients. Each skill he'd demonstrated pulled him closer to a truth he'd spent 5 years burying. Elena's sharp eyes missed nothing, and he could feel her piecing together the puzzle of who he really was. The ranger station materialized through the swirling snow like a broken promise. Half the roof had collapsed under the weight of accumulated snow and ice, and the radio tower lay twisted and useless among the debris. But the stone foundation remained intact, and Marcus could see possibilities where others saw only destruction. "It's ruined," David muttered, his voice hollow with despair. "We came all this way for nothing." "Not nothing," Marcus said, already moving toward the wreckage. "The foundation's solid, and look." He pointed to a section where the roof had partially collapsed, but created a natural lean-to. "We can work with this." As the others caught up, Marcus began clearing snow from what had been the station's main room. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, and he found himself falling into patterns he'd learned not in survival courses or outdoor programs, but in those final desperate weeks before everything went wrong, before the facility, before the experiments, before he'd learned what his father had really been doing in those sterile white rooms. "You're bleeding," Elena observed, appearing beside him as he hauled a fallen beam aside. Marcus looked down at his hands. His gloves had torn, and blood seeped through the fabric. He hadn't even felt it. "It's nothing." "Like hell it is." She grabbed his wrist, her grip surprisingly strong. "You've been pushing yourself beyond your limits for hours. Why?" Their eyes met, and Marcus saw something in her expression that made his stomach drop. Recognition. Not of his face, but of something deeper, something that connected to the careful way he'd been watching the group, cataloging their strengths and weaknesses, assessing their psychological states with clinical precision. "Because people die when I don't," he said quietly, pulling away from her grip. Sarah called out from where she'd been exploring the wreckage. "I found the emergency supplies." Her voice carried the first note of hope any of them had expressed in hours. She emerged from a partially buried storage room, dragging a waterproof container behind her. The discovery galvanized the group. Inside the container were emergency blankets, a first aid kit, flares, and most crucially, a backup radio unit. David immediately began examining the radio while Marcus and the others worked to create a more substantial shelter using the salvaged materials. As Marcus lashed together support beams using paracord, muscle memory guided his movements. These were knots he'd learned not from outdoor manuals but from classified training protocols. Each technique had been drilled into him by instructors who'd treated children like weapons to be forged and sharpened. "The radio's damaged," David announced, his voice strained. "I can get power, but the antenna array is completely destroyed." Marcus paused in his work. "How much power?" "Maybe enough for one transmission burst. Short range only." "That might be enough." Marcus set down his tools and moved to where David crouched over the radio components. "There's a technique for amplifying weak signals using metallic debris. We'd need to create a makeshift antenna array using the wreckage from the tower." Elena appeared at his shoulder. "Where exactly did you learn that?" The question hung in the air like a blade. Marcus felt the weight of 5 years of careful lies pressing down on him. Around them, the others had stopped working and were listening with undisguised curiosity. "Same place I learned everything else," he said finally. "Trial and error." But Elena's expression told him she wasn't buying it. Trial and error doesn't teach you how to construct emergency radio amplifiers, or how to perform field triage with that level of precision, or how to read psychological stress patterns in a group dynamic. The last observation hit Marcus like a physical blow. He'd been doing it unconsciously, monitoring each person's breaking point, calculating optimal work distributions, managing group morale through carefully timed interventions. All techniques burned into his neural pathways during those nightmare months when they had been preparing him for missions that would have destroyed what remained of his soul. Thunder rolled overhead despite the falling snow, an anomaly that made everyone look up nervously. In the distance, Marcus thought he heard something else beneath the thunder, something mechanical and rhythmic, helicopter rotors. His blood turned to ice. After 5 years of perfect hiding, of careful anonymity, had his use of classified survival techniques finally drawn attention from people he'd hoped never to see again? The abandoned ranger station emerged from the whiteout like a ghost ship, its snow-laden roof barely visible against the storm's fury. Marcus pressed his face against the frosted window, squinting through the darkness at what might be their salvation. "There," he pointed, his breath fogging the glass. "We can shelter there until the storm passes." Sarah pulled herself upright, wincing as the movement sent fresh waves of pain through her injured ankle. "Are you sure it's safe? What if someone's still—" "No one's been here in years," Marcus cut her off, perhaps too quickly. He avoided her questioning gaze, focusing instead on the storm raging outside. The Park Service abandoned this sector after the budget cuts. But that wasn't entirely true. Marcus knew this place intimately. Every creaking floorboard, every loose window latch, every hiding spot carved into the walls. This had been his home for 3 months after he'd first fled into the mountains, before he'd learned to build proper shelters in the deep wilderness. The trek to the building took every ounce of their remaining strength. The wind howled with supernatural fury, driving ice crystals like needles into any exposed skin. Marcus broke trail through waist-deep snow, while David and Tom supported Sarah between them, her face grey with pain and exhaustion. The front door was frozen shut, but Marcus knew about the loose board on the back porch. He pried it away, revealing the spare key he'd left there years ago, a contingency he'd hoped never to use. His hands trembled as he worked the lock, and not from the cold. Inside, the station was a tomb of memories. Dust sheets covered old furniture, and mouse droppings littered the floor, but it was gloriously warm compared to the hellscape outside. Marcus quickly assessed their resources, a working fireplace, some emergency supplies he'd hidden in the walls, and most importantly, a radio that might still connect to the outside world. "Jesus, this place gives me the creeps," Tom muttered, helping Sarah onto an old couch. "How did you even know about it?" Marcus busied himself with starting a fire. using the friction method he'd taught them earlier. Stumbled across it during one of my longer expeditions. Lucky break. Another lie. The truth was that this station appeared on no current Park Service maps. It had been decommissioned and forgotten, which made it perfect for someone who needed to disappear. Someone like Jake Brennan, the frightened 19-year-old who'd fled here after witnessing something he was never supposed to see. As flames caught in the fireplace, casting dancing shadows across the walls, Marcus noticed David watching him with calculating eyes. The insurance investigator had been quiet during their journey, but Marcus could sense the man's mind working, cataloguing inconsistencies in his story. "You know," David said conversationally, "I've been thinking about that survival technique you used back at the ravine, the one your grandfather taught you." Marcus kept his expression neutral. "What about it?" "It reminded me of something I read in a case file once. A missing person case, actually. Kid disappeared 5 years ago, right around here. Authorities found evidence he'd been surviving in the wilderness using some pretty sophisticated techniques. Techniques that weren't exactly common knowledge." Sarah looked up from where she was examining her ankle. "What are you getting at, David?" "Just curious about the coincidence. Same area, same time frame, same unusual skill set." David's smile was cold. "You wouldn't happen to know anything about Jake Brennan, would you, Marcus?" The name hung in the air like a death sentence. Marcus felt his carefully constructed world beginning to crumble, but he forced his hands to remain steady as he fed more wood to the fire. "Never heard of him." "Funny thing about Jake Brennan," David continued relentlessly. "He witnessed something he shouldn't have. A certain insurance fraud scheme involving fake accident claims and staged deaths in remote wilderness areas. Very profitable operation, until some college kid stumbled across it during a camping trip." Tom frowned. "What does this have to do with—" "The kid disappeared before he could testify," David interrupted. "Vanished into these mountains like smoke, but the case never officially closed. Some of us kept looking." Marcus finally turned to face him, and for a moment his mask slipped. David saw something flicker in those eyes, fear, desperation, and a kind of weary resignation. "Even if this Jake Brennan was still alive," Marcus said quietly, "maybe he had good reasons for staying hidden. Maybe testifying would have gotten him killed." "Maybe," David agreed. "But times change. The people he was afraid of, they're mostly in prison now or dead. That profitable little operation got shut down through other means." Outside, the storm raged with renewed fury, as if nature itself was demanding an answer. Marcus stared into the fire, seeing his past and present colliding in the flames. The moment of truth had finally arrived. The wind had died to an eerie whisper by the time Marcus finished checking on Sarah and Tom in the second shelter. Both were stable, their breathing steady in the warmth of the insulated space he deconstructed, using techniques that felt both foreign and familiar in his hands. But as he crawled back through the connecting tunnel to the main shelter where Elena waited, the weight of what he'd revealed pressed down on him harder than any avalanche. Elena looked up as he emerged, her eyes searching his face in the flickering light of the small fire he'd managed to coax from wet kindling. "They're okay? For now." Marcus settled beside her, his movements careful and deliberate. The adrenaline that had carried him through the crisis was fading, leaving behind the stark reality of what came next. "Elena, there's more you need to know." She shifted closer, and he caught the scent of pine smoke in her hair. "About your father? About why you really came up here?" The question hung between them like a blade. Marcus stared into the flames, watching them dance and flicker, and saw his father's face in the orange glow. Dr. James Holloway, respected researcher, loving father, and architect of a program that had turned children into something unrecognizable. "My father didn't just study survival techniques," Marcus began, his voice barely audible above the wind. "He was contracted by a government program called Project Endurance. They were developing enhanced interrogation resistance protocols for special operations personnel." Elena's intake of breath was sharp. "Enhanced? How?" "They took kids, orphans mostly, some from military families who were told their children were attending an elite wilderness camp. We were subjected to extreme survival scenarios, psychological conditioning, memory manipulation techniques. The words felt like glass in his throat. The goal was to create operatives who could survive anything, endure any hardship, withstand any pressure. Jesus, Marcus. How old were you? 8 when it started. 12 when I finally escaped. He turned to look at her, seeing the horror dawning in her eyes. The techniques I've been using to keep us alive, the shelters, the fire-making, the way I can read the mountain's moods, they're not traditional skills passed down through generations. They're the product of 5 years of systematic psychological and physical conditioning. Elena reached for his hand, her fingers cold but steady. That's why you disappeared. You were running from them. I thought I was safe. I'd been living off-grid for 5 years, staying mobile, never using my real name. Marcus's jaw tightened. But 3 weeks ago I saw one of them in Breckenridge. Dr. Sarah Chen, one of my father's colleagues. She was asking questions about a young man matching my description who'd been spotted in the area. The fire popped, sending sparks spiraling upward toward the ventilation hole Marcus had carefully constructed. Elena squeezed his hand tighter. So, you came up here to hide, to disappear completely, if necessary. The admission tasted bitter. I had supplies cached throughout these mountains, emergency protocols my father never knew about. I was prepared to vanish forever rather than let them find me. Elena was quiet for a long moment, processing. When she spoke, her voice was steady. But you saved us instead. I couldn't leave you to die. The words came out more raw than he'd intended. When I saw that helicopter go down, when I realized there were survivors trapped in this storm, I knew I had to choose. My freedom or your lives. Marcus, they can't still be looking for you. It's been 5 years. Surely the program was shut down officially in 2019 after a congressional investigation. Marcus's laugh held no humor. But they lost track of several subjects, including me. From what I could piece together, they've been quietly trying to locate us ever since. Loose ends, Elena. That's all we are to them. The implications of what he was saying settled between them like a physical presence. By using his skills so extensively, by demonstrating capabilities that no ordinary survivalist should possess, Marcus had essentially painted a target on his back that would be visible from space to anyone who knew what to look for. The rescue teams, Elena whispered. When they come, when they see what you've built here, they'll ask questions I can't answer without revealing everything. Marcus met her eyes, and once that information gets into official reports, it's only a matter of time before it reaches the wrong people. Elena stared at him for a long moment, then surprised him by moving closer, resting her head against his shoulder. Then we make sure it doesn't. Elena. No. Her voice was firm. You saved our lives, all of us. I'm not going to let you sacrifice yourself for us twice. She lifted her head to look at him. We'll figure this out together. There has to be a way. Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault on the mountain, but inside their small shelter, something had shifted. Marcus felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire spreading through his chest. For the first time in 5 years, he wasn't running alone. The wind had died to an eerie whisper, but Marcus knew better than to trust the mountain's deception. He crouched beside the makeshift shelter they'd built in the lee of a massive boulder, watching Sarah tend to Chen's frostbitten fingers with strips torn from her own shirt. The technique his grandfather had taught him, reading the storm's breathing patterns, told him they had maybe 30 minutes before the next wave hit. We need to move, he said quietly, his breath forming small clouds in the bitter air. This is just the eye passing over us. Sarah looked up, her face pale but determined. Chen can barely feel his hands. Jake's ankle. We'll kill him if we stay here. Marcus's voice carried an edge that made everyone look at him. Trust me on this. I've seen what happens when people wait out the second wave in the open. Jake shifted against the rock wall, wincing as he adjusted his makeshift splint. How do you know so much about? He stopped, studying Marcus's face in the dim light. "You're him, aren't you? The kid from the Brennan family." The words hit like a physical blow. Marcus felt his carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble as 4 pairs of eyes fixed on him. He'd managed to keep his identity buried for 5 years, moving through these mountains like a ghost, helping lost hikers from the shadows. But now, trapped with nowhere to run, the past had finally caught up. "I don't know what you're talking about," Marcus said, but his voice betrayed him with the slightest tremor. "Marcus Brennan," Jake pressed, his journalist's instincts overriding his pain. "Disappeared when he was 16 after the search for his family was called off. They said he probably died of exposure, but some people thought—" "Stop!" The word came out sharper than Marcus intended. Sarah was staring at him now with a mixture of recognition and something that might have been pity. He couldn't bear that look. Chen spoke up weakly from where he lay. "The survival techniques you know, they're not from books, are they? You learned them because you had to." Marcus closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the secret he'd carried crushing down on him. The grandfather who'd taught him to read storms, to find water under snow, to build fires in impossible conditions, the same grandfather whose greed had led their family into these mountains during the worst blizzard in decades. The grandfather who'd insisted they could reach the old mining claim, that the forecast was wrong, that Marcus was being weak for suggesting they turn back. "My grandfather thought he knew better than the weather service," Marcus said finally, his voice barely audible above the wind. "Thought we could beat a storm to reach his old claim up in Devil's Canyon. Said there was still gold up there, enough to set us up for life." The memory came flooding back, the temperature dropping 40 degrees in 2 hours, his little sister Emma crying as the snow whipped around them, his parents arguing with his grandfather about finding shelter, and then the avalanche, triggered by his grandfather's dynamite as he tried to blast their way into a snow-blocked cave. "I was the only one who made it out," Marcus continued, staring at his hands. "Spent 3 days digging, calling for them, but the snow was too deep, and I was just a kid who didn't know enough yet." He looked up at Jake. "So yeah, I learned everything my grandfather should have taught me before he got them all killed. And I stayed up here because I couldn't face going back down to a world that would blame me for surviving when they didn't." Sarah reached out and touched his arm gently. "Marcus, it wasn't your fault. You were just a child. Tell that to the reporters who called me the miracle boy and wanted to know why I didn't do more to save them. Tell that to the investigators who questioned whether a 16-year-old really couldn't have prevented 5 deaths. His laugh was bitter. "So I gave them what they wanted, another casualty. Let them assume I died up here too." A low rumble in the distance made them all freeze. Marcus's head snapped up, his trained senses immediately cataloguing the sound. Not thunder, something worse. "Avalanche," he said, jumping to his feet. "Big one. Maybe 2 ridges over. The storm's destabilizing everything." He grabbed his pack, his personal crisis temporarily forgotten in the face of immediate danger. "We need to reach the old mining station before the second wave hits. It's our only chance." Jake struggled to stand. "How far?" "1/4 mile, but it's straight up." Marcus looked at each of them, seeing his own desperation reflected in their faces. "I won't lose anyone else to this mountain. I won't." The wind began to pick up again, and Marcus felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. This time, though, he wouldn't be carrying it alone. This time, he might actually have the chance to save the people counting on him. The storm was far from over, but neither was he. The satellite phone crackled to life in Marcus's trembling hands, its green display cutting through the pre-dawn darkness of their makeshift shelter. After 3 days of radio silence, the device had finally caught a signal from the emergency beacon they'd activated. "This is Search and Rescue Station Alpha. We have your coordinates. Are you injured? How many in your party?" Marcus pressed the transmit button, his voice hoarse from the cold. 4 survivors, 1 with severe hypothermia, 2 with minor frostbite. We need immediate evacuation. Through the static, he could hear the dispatcher's keyboard clicking. Copy that. Weather window opens in approximately 6 hours. We'll have a helicopter en route at first light. Can you maintain your position? Marcus glanced around their snow cave where Sarah lay unconscious, wrapped in every piece of spare clothing they could find. Her breathing was shallow but steady. Jake sat beside her, methodically exercising his fingers to maintain circulation, while Elena kept watch near the entrance. "We'll be here," Marcus replied. But as he ended the transmission, a familiar dread settled in his stomach. Rescue meant questions, questions meant scrutiny, and scrutiny meant his carefully constructed isolation would crumble like frost in sunlight. Elena crawled over to him, her eyes reflecting the phone's dim glow. 6 hours, she whispered. "We made it." Marcus nodded, but his mind was already racing ahead to what came next. The rescue would be covered by local news. His photo would be taken. Someone from his past life would recognize the boy who had vanished into these mountains 5 years ago, the one whose disappearance had launched a manhunt that found nothing but his abandoned car at a trailhead, the boy who was supposed to be dead. "Marcus." Jake's voice was urgent. "Sarah's not responding." Marcus quickly moved to Sarah's side, placing his ear near her mouth. Her breathing had become even more labored, and her skin had taken on a waxy pallor that he recognized from the survival manuals his grandfather had drilled into him during those harsh winter months in the cabin. "Her core temperature is dropping too fast," Marcus said, his training overriding his anxiety. "We need to rewarm her gradually." He began the careful process his grandfather had taught him, using body heat and controlled breathing techniques that most wilderness guides never learned. The methods were old, passed down through generations of mountain dwellers who understood the delicate balance between life and death in these peaks. As he worked, Elena watched with a mixture of admiration and curiosity that made Marcus's chest tighten. "Where did you learn all this?" she asked quietly, the question he'd been dreading. Marcus continued his ministrations to Sarah, buying time. "Trial and error," he said finally. "That's not trial and error," Elena pressed. "That's training, professional training." Jake looked up from where he was monitoring Sarah's pulse. "She's right, man. You've saved all our lives with techniques I've never seen before, and I've been hiking these mountains for 15 years. Marcus felt the walls closing in. In 6 hours, the helicopter would arrive. In 7 hours, they would be in a hospital where records were kept, where social workers asked questions about next of kin and emergency contacts, where computer databases would flag his fingerprints and facial recognition software would match him to missing person reports that were still technically active. But worse than the exposure was what it would mean for the people he'd left behind. His sister Emma, who had finally started college after years of therapy, his mother, who had moved across the country to escape the media attention surrounding his disappearance. They had found peace in believing he was dead. His return would shatter that peace, would drag them back into the nightmare of his father's trial, the scandal that had driven him into these mountains in the first place. The trial where his testimony was the key evidence that put his father in prison for embezzling millions from the disaster relief charity he had run. The trial that had made Marcus a target for his father's associates, men who had made it clear that the son who knew too much about their operation wouldn't be safe anywhere. Sarah stirred slightly, her eyelids fluttering. Marcus's techniques were working, but she wasn't out of danger yet. "Come on," he whispered, adjusting the warming routine. "Stay with us." Elena placed her hand on his shoulder. "Whatever you're running from," she said softly, "it can't be worse than dying up here." But she was wrong. Marcus had made his choice 5 years ago when he staged his own disappearance and disappeared into the wilderness his grandfather had taught him to navigate. He had chosen exile over exposing the people he loved to danger. In 6 hours, that choice would be tested again. As Sarah's breathing gradually strengthened under his care, Marcus realized that saving these 3 people might mean sacrificing the safety he had bought with 5 years of solitude. The wind howled outside their shelter, but for the first time in days it sounded like it was beginning to die down. The wind had finally died to a whisper, but the silence felt more ominous than the storm's fury. Marcus crouched beside the emergency shelter they'd built using his father's old techniques, watching the horizon through the pre-dawn gloom. The other survivors huddled inside, their breathing creating small clouds that dissipated quickly in the bitter air. Sarah emerged from the shelter, moving carefully on her injured ankle. "The radio's picking up chatter," she whispered. "Search and rescue teams are mobilizing, but there's something else. Police frequencies are active too." Marcus's stomach clenched. He'd known this moment would come eventually, but not like this, not when people's lives still hung in the balance. "What kind of police chatter?" he asked, though he already suspected the answer. "They're looking for someone. A fugitive, 5-year-old case." Her eyes searched his face in the dim light. "Marcus, yesterday when you saved Tom from that crevasse, the way you moved, the techniques you used, that wasn't just wilderness training, was it?" Before he could answer, a distant rumble echoed across the valley. Helicopter rotors. Marcus felt his pulse quicken as he scanned the sky, spotting the dark silhouette approaching from the east. Behind it, 2 more aircraft followed. "Everyone needs to stay calm," he said, but Sarah grabbed his arm. "Marcus, whatever you're running from, we can work through it. You saved our lives. That has to count for something." The memories crashed over him like an avalanche he'd been holding back for years. The night 5 years ago when he'd discovered his father's research partner, Dr. Elizabeth Kane, selling classified military survival data to foreign contacts. The confrontation in the lab, the struggle, the way she'd fallen, hitting her head on the metal equipment rack. He'd panicked, fled into the mountains using every technique his father had ever taught him. For 5 years, he'd convinced himself he was a killer. But yesterday, watching Tom nearly die in that crevasse, something had shifted. The same hands that had supposedly taken a life had pulled a man back from death. "Sarah, I need you to listen carefully," he began. But the lead helicopter was already descending toward their position, snow swirling up in violent eddies from its rotors. Inside the shelter, Jennifer helped steady old Pete as he struggled to sit up. The man was stronger now, the wilderness medicine Marcus had administered pulling him back from hypothermia's edge. Tom flexed his fingers, testing the feeling that had returned to his frost-nipped extremities. "Whatever happens," Marcus called to them over the increasing noise, "remember that you're all survivors. You have everything you need inside you to make it out of here." The helicopter touched down 50 yards away, and figures in winter gear began emerging. Marcus could see the mix of search and rescue personnel and law enforcement officers. His 5 years of freedom were ending. Agent Rebecca Torres was the first to reach them, her badge visible even through her heavy coat. "Marcus Reed," she called out, but her voice wasn't as harsh as he'd expected. "We need to talk." "The others need medical attention first," Marcus replied, positioning himself between the agent and the shelter. "They've been through hell." "We have paramedics standing by," Torres assured him. "But Marcus, there's something you need to know about Dr. Kane's death. Something that changes everything." Marcus froze. "Changes what?" Torres pulled out a tablet, shielding the screen from the wind. "Security footage from that night. We recovered it from a damaged hard drive 3 months ago. Dr. Kane didn't die from the fall, Marcus. She got up after you left. She died 2 hours later from a brain aneurysm that would have killed her regardless." The medical examiner confirmed it was a pre-existing condition. The words hit him harder than any mountain wind. "What are you saying?" "You didn't kill anyone. You never did." Torres's expression softened. "But you disappeared before we could investigate properly. We've been looking for you as a witness, not a suspect. Dr. Kane's real killer was her contact, the man she was selling information to. He poisoned her weeks earlier with a slow-acting compound that caused the aneurysm." Marcus felt his knees nearly buckle. 5 years of guilt, 5 years of exile, based on a truth he'd never known. Around him, the rescue operation continued as paramedics attended to his companions, but their voices seemed to come from another world. Sarah limped over to him, her hand finding his shoulder. "Marcus?" He looked at her, then at the others being carefully loaded onto medical transport sleds. These people were alive because of techniques his father had taught him, knowledge he'd preserved through years of hiding. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent 5 years running from a crime he hadn't committed, becoming exactly the kind of person who could save lives in impossible circumstances. "Agent Torres," he said finally, his voice steady despite everything. "I have information about Dr. Kane's research that might help your case. But first, I need to make sure my friends get to safety." The rescue helicopter's rotors beat against the thinning storm as Marcus watched the mountain peak shrink below them. Sarah sat across from him, her frostbitten fingers wrapped around a thermos of hot coffee, her eyes never leaving his face. The other survivors had been airlifted out an hour earlier, but she'd insisted on waiting for him. "You saved us all," she said over the engine noise. "But you're going back, aren't you?" Marcus nodded, his gaze fixed on the endless white expanse below. "This is where I belong." The pilot's voice crackled through the headset. "Search and rescue base, this is Mountain Eagle 7. We've got confirmation. The missing persons case for Marcus Chen has been officially closed. Repeat, subject found alive and well." Marcus pulled off his headset and handed it to Sarah. "Tell them Marcus Chen died in that blizzard 5 years ago. The person they're looking at now. He's someone else." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "You can't just disappear again. There are people who care about you, who've been looking. My parents died thinking their son was a coward who ran away after what happened to Jenny." Marcus's voice was barely audible above the helicopter noise. "Maybe that's better than them knowing the truth about what I've become." "He's been tracking cold cases," Sarah whispered, following Marcus's gaze. "Looking for connections to missing hikers over the past 5 years. He knows you've been out there." Marcus's blood ran cold. If Morrison had been investigating, if he'd found the other survivors Marcus had helped over the years, it would only be a matter of time before the pattern emerged. The mysterious mountain man who appeared during disasters, the one who always knew exactly how to keep people alive against impossible odds. The one who disappeared before anyone could ask too many questions. "I have to go," Marcus said, moving toward the helicopter door. Sarah grabbed his arm. "Wait." She pressed something into his palm, a small GPS device. "Channel 7. If you ever need help, if you ever want to come back to the world, just turn it on." The helicopter door slid open, and Marcus stepped onto the tarmac. Immediately, reporters surged forward, cameras flashing, voices shouting questions about the mysterious survivalist who'd guided 8 people to safety. Morrison pushed through the crowd, his hand resting on his radio. "Marcus Chen," the detective called out, "I've been looking for you for a very long time." Marcus met his eyes across the chaos. In that moment, he saw Morrison's recognition, the pieces clicking together in the old detective's mind. The survival techniques that seemed too advanced, too specialized for a college dropout. The way Marcus moved through the mountains like he'd been trained for warfare. The careful way he'd avoided leaving traces, avoided being photographed or recorded. Morrison's hand moved slowly toward his handcuffs. "I think we need to have a conversation about some missing persons cases, starting with what really happened the night Jenny Martinez died." The crowd of reporters and rescue workers created a wall of bodies between them. Marcus looked back at Sarah one last time, memorizing her face, then melted into the confusion of the evacuation scene. Years of mountain survival had taught him how to become invisible, how to move without being tracked. By the time Morrison fought through the crowd, Marcus had vanished. 3 hours later, Marcus stood on a ridge overlooking the rescue operation, watching through binoculars as the helicopter crews finished their work. The storm had passed completely, leaving behind a crystalline wilderness that stretched endlessly in every direction. His wilderness, his sanctuary, his prison. He pulled out the GPS device Sarah had given him, studying its small screen. For 5 years he'd lived with the weight of what he'd done, the training that had saved lives but couldn't save the one that mattered most, the government program that had turned him into the perfect survivor, then abandoned him when he'd broken under the pressure. Jenny's death hadn't been an accident. It had been a test that went wrong, A final evaluation that cost an innocent woman her life, and Marcus had run, choosing exile over accountability, survival over justice. But today, watching 8 people return safely to their families, he'd remembered something else the mountains had taught him. Sometimes the only way to truly survive was to stop running. Marcus turned on the GPS device and set it on a prominent rock where it would be easily found. Then he walked deeper into the wilderness, not to hide this time, but to wait. When they came for him, and they would come, he'd be ready to face what he'd been running from. The mountain wind carried his words down towards civilization. I'm ready to remember.